Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active. That way he could race against Brexton. To have that moment of symbolization for Kyle and just see Brexton standing there, it was a moment of, wow, he's gone. And we're not going to get him back.
Kyle Busch spent more than 2 decades becoming the winningest driver in NASCAR history. And then, within 11 days, an illness that looked like nothing more than a stubborn sinus cold took his life. His older brother, Kurt Busch, has spent the months since piecing together in public what those final days actually looked like from the inside. This is what Kurt has actually said, in his own words, and what it reveals about how a 2-time champion's story really ended. Long before either Busch brother ever strapped into a stock car, they were the sons of a Las Vegas mechanic named Tom Busch, a man who kept the family building and fixing cars out of necessity and passion long before racing became a career for either of his sons. Kurt was the one who turned pro first, breaking into NASCAR's national ranks in 2000 and winning the Cup Series championship in 2004. Kyle followed a few years behind him, and for most of the 2000s and 2010s, the two brothers turned their sibling relationship into one of the defining rivalries in the sport, refusing to give each other an inch even when it meant wrecking one another on national television, as happened during an infamous 2007 All-Star race incident that reportedly left the brothers not speaking for months until their grandmother stepped in to broker peace. That rivalry mellowed over time into something that looked a lot more like pride. When Kurt retired from full-time competition after the 2023 season, closing out a career built on 34 Cup Series wins across 776 starts, Kyle was one of the first people to publicly celebrate him, and the two stayed close as Kurt shifted into a mentorship and ownership role while Kyle kept racing full-time, eventually landing at Richard Childress Racing. Kurt's own resume is nothing to scoff at either, a Daytona 500 win in 2017 that capped one of the more improbable comeback stories the sport has seen, a rare sweep of the All-Star race and the Coca-Cola 600 in the same night back in 2010, and a permanent spot among NASCAR's 75 greatest drivers. That resume is part of why January of 2026 stands out so much now. Kurt was formally inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame that month, and Kyle stood next to him as his presenter, telling the crowd how meaningful it had been to watch his older brother believe in himself long before the trophies caught up. Photographers captured the two of them together on the red carpet that night, smiling, finally on the same side of a rivalry that had once nearly torn them apart. Together, the Busch brothers hold the record for the most combined Cup Series wins by any siblings in NASCAR history, and they remain the only brothers to each individually reach 30 Cup wins. Neither of them could have known that photo would resurface again just a few months later for an entirely different reason. The story of what actually happened to Kyle starts at Watkins Glen on May 10, 2026, when he radioed his team after a race asking for a doctor and what he described as a shot, dealing with what sounded like an ordinary sinus cold. Nobody around him treated it as an emergency, and by every outward measure, it wasn't one yet. Kyle kept working through it. He won a Truck Series race at Dover just 6 days before his death, his final win, and one that broke his own series wins record, then finished 17th in the NASCAR All-Star race, and in between all of that, he still showed up to open a go-kart track with his 11-year-old son, Brexton. Then, on Wednesday, May 20th, while testing in a Chevrolet simulator in Concord, North Carolina, Kyle became unresponsive. Emergency responders were called, and reports have since described him experiencing shortness of breath, overheating, and coughing up blood in the hours before he was hospitalized. The Busch family's first public statement said only that Kyle had been hospitalized with a severe illness and would not be racing in the upcoming Coca-Cola 600. Less than 24 hours later, on Thursday, May 21, 2026, Kyle Busch died. He was 41 years old. 2 days after his death, the family released a fuller explanation. A medical evaluation had concluded that severe pneumonia progressed into sepsis, causing rapid and overwhelming complications. A death certificate later obtained by reporters filled in more of the timeline, showing Kyle had likely been fighting bacterial pneumonia for days, possibly weeks, before sepsis finally took hold. Once sepsis set in, it triggered disseminated intravascular coagulation, a rare and dangerous blood clotting disorder, which in turn led to hemorrhagic shock. Medical experts who reviewed the case afterward were struck by how quickly that final stage moved, a pace that reportedly surprised even physicians accustomed to treating severe infections. For a family that had spent decades around a sport built on visible physical risk, The idea that a case of pneumonia could take Kyle within a matter of days was almost impossible to square, and that disbelief is exactly what would eventually come through in Kurt's own words. Kurt didn't say anything publicly right away. It took more than 2 weeks after his brother's death for him to post anything at all, finally breaking his silence on Instagram on June 8, 2026, alongside a collage of old family photos spanning both of their lives. He opened by thanking fans for the outpouring of support, then reflected on growing up racing anything he and Kyle could get their hands on, from go-karts as kids to the biggest stages in motorsports as adults, describing their bond as something that went well beyond competition. Kurt wrote that no trophy or championship could ever measure what Kyle meant to him, and closed the post by telling his younger brother to cite index equals 12-1. Rest easy, little brother. /cite. Kurt's grief resurfaced in an even more visible way roughly 3 months later, in a preview clip from a NASCAR-themed docuseries that aired in mid-August 2026. In that clip, Kurt grew visibly emotional, explaining how fatherhood had reshaped Kyle's priorities in his final years. As Kurt told it, Kyle wanted to keep racing and stay active specifically so that he could one day compete against his own son, Braxton, much the way their father Tom had once pushed both Busch boys into the sport. Kurt also described the moment during the pre-race memorial tribute when he watched Braxton standing beside his mother, Samantha, and admitted that seeing his nephew there forced him to fully accept that his brother was actually gone. Kyle's widow, Samantha, had broken her own silence a few days before Kurt did, posting to Instagram on Friday, June 5, 2026. In that message, she thanked the outpouring of support that had carried the family through what she called cite index equals for -1, 6-1, the most heartbreaking days of their lives, /cite. Describing the family as absolutely shattered while thanking fans and strangers alike for showing up for Braxton and their younger daughter, Lennox. Kurt has echoed that same gratitude nearly every time he's spoken publicly about Kyle's family since. Kurt wasn't the only person in Kyle's orbit trying to make sense of how quickly everything changed. Dale Earnhardt Jr., who spent years as one of Kyle's fiercest rivals before the two developed a genuine friendship built around short track and late model racing, revealed on his own podcast that he had been texting with Kyle the day before he passed. The two were finalizing plans for Kyle to drive one of Earnhardt's late model cars in an upcoming Cars Tour race at North Wilkesboro. When Earnhardt asked what number Kyle wanted to run, Kyle didn't hesitate. He wanted to run Earnhardt's old number. As Earnhardt recalled it on his podcast, cite index equals 22-1, Kyle told him, "I want to run the Dale Jr. 8/cite," and Earnhardt agreed on the spot. It was a lighthearted, forward-looking exchange between two friends planning a future race weekend, which is exactly what makes it so hard for Earnhardt to look back on now, knowing it happened less than a day before Kyle collapsed in that simulator. Richard Childress, the team owner who guided Kyle through the final stretch of his Cup Series career, has offered his own reflections in the months since. Childress has recalled speaking with Kyle by phone the night before he was hospitalized, with no sign that anything serious was unfolding, and has compared the shock of losing Kyle to the loss of Dale Earnhardt Sr. at the 2001 Daytona 500. A driver Childress also fielded cars for and lost far too soon. Losing two of the greatest drivers the sport has ever produced under his own organization is something Childress has said he never expected to have to process twice in one lifetime. That same grief eventually turned into an unusual debate that Kurt himself had to weigh in on. As a newly inducted Hall of Famer, Kurt now carries an actual vote in future induction decisions. And when reporters asked whether NASCAR should fast-track Kyle into the Hall of Fame given the circumstances, Kurt pushed back gently. He told reporters he believed the sport should stick to its normal process rather than rush it, even while making clear he considers his brother one of the strongest candidates the Hall has ever had. It was a striking moment of restraint from a man who had every emotional reason to want his brother honored immediately, and it said a lot about how seriously Kurt takes the integrity of an institution he now has a hand in overseeing. It's worth stepping back to measure exactly what was lost, because the scale of Kyle's career is a big part of why Kurt's grief has resonated so widely across the sport. By the time of his death, Kyle stood as the winningest driver across NASCAR's 3 national touring series combined, with 234 total wins spanning the Cup Series, the Xfinity Series, and the Truck Series. A number Richard Childress has said publicly he doubts will ever be matched again. Kyle's 63 Cup Series wins rank 9th all-time. He won 2 Cup Series championships in 2015 and 2019, plus 2 regular season titles, and he was still racing and winning in the days before his death, with that final Truck Series victory at Dover coming just 6 days before he was hospitalized. Beyond the numbers, Kyle built his own Truck Series organization into a launching pad for younger drivers, mentoring the next generation the way older drivers had once mentored him. NASCAR's leadership captured that side of his legacy in a pre-race tribute held before the Coca-Cola 600, telling the crowd that what people would miss most wasn't the trophies but the quieter moments. A driver who'd help a teammate or offer advice without anyone watching. That tribute turned an ordinary Memorial Day weekend race into something closer to a public memorial, with roughly 95,000 fans in the stands at Charlotte Motor Speedway. NASCAR painted a black number 8 into the infield grass beside Kyle's old pit stall. Every car in the field carried a decal in his honor, and the field ran a moment of silence and a missing man tribute during pace laps. Kurt joined his parents, Samantha, Brexton, and Lennox on the front stretch that evening to lay 8 white roses across the painted number, while a bagpiper played nearby. Daniel Suarez, a driver Kyle had personally mentored, went on to win that race and dedicated the victory to the Busch family in tears afterward. Richard Childress has since confirmed that Kyle's number 8 will not be permanently retired. Instead, it's being set aside for Brexton whenever he's ready to race at NASCAR's highest level. A decision that gives Kurt's nephew a direct, tangible path to carrying his father's legacy forward on the track someday, should he choose to. Before any of Kurt's public statements, there was a much quieter moment the family kept almost entirely out of view. A private memorial service for Kyle was held in Charlotte on June 2, 2026, attended by family, teammates, and close friends rather than the wider public. NASCAR and Richard Childress Racing largely respected the family's wish for privacy around that service, which is part of why the Coca-Cola 600 tribute and the later public comments from Kurt, Samantha, and others carried so much weight. For most fans, those moments were the closest thing to a public farewell they were ever going to get. What happened just hours after that private service says a lot about how the family chose to move forward. Brexton, Kyle's 11-year-old son, went back to racing that same day, climbing into a car only hours after saying goodbye to his father. It wasn't framed as anyone rushing past grief. If anything, it lined up with something Kyle himself had talked about publicly in the past. Kyle had said more than once that part of his long-term plan was to keep racing long enough to eventually compete against Brexton, and had even floated the idea of the two of them sharing a truck team ride together down the road. Watching his son return to the track within hours of the funeral looked, to a lot of people who'd followed the family for years, like Brexton continuing exactly the path his father had been building for him. While the family dealt with all of this privately, fans were doing their own version of processing it in public. In the days right after Kyle's death, makeshift memorials sprang up outside tracks connected to his career, including a growing pile of flowers, M&Ms, caps, T-shirts, and handwritten notes left outside the Daytona International Speedway Tours building. It became one of several informal gathering points where fans who never met Kyle personally could still show up and leave something behind, a pattern that's become familiar in NASCAR after the sport has lost a major figure. Kurt's comments in the months since have also nodded toward a side of Kyle that goes beyond wins and championships. Off the track, Kyle had built out a life far bigger than racing. He co-founded the energy drink brand Rowdy Energy, established the Kyle Busch Foundation to support underprivileged children, and early in his career donated an entire season's Cup Series winnings to Hurricane Katrina relief through the American Red Cross. He even crossed over into pop culture, appearing as a WWE guest host on multiple occasions and briefly holding the promotion's 24/7 championship for less than a day after pinning wrestler R-Truth. A stunt that delighted fans who knew him as one of the sport's more unpredictable personalities. None of that shows up in a stat sheet, but it's exactly the kind of detail Kurt and others close to Kyle have leaned on when trying to describe who he was away from the cockpit, rather than just what he accomplished inside it. For now, that legacy rests largely with Kurt, who has taken on the dual role of grieving brother and public steward of a career that reshaped what winning across NASCAR's National Series actually looks like. From the emotional Instagram post in June, to the tearful docuseries interview in August, to his careful, measured comments on Hall of Fame timing, everything Kurt has said publicly since May reflects a man trying to honor his brother's memory with the same steadiness Kyle was known for behind the wheel. Kurt has kept showing up at NASCAR events, sitting for interviews he's openly found difficult, and choosing his words with a caution that stands in sharp contrast to the emotion he shows every time the conversation turns personal. It's worth remembering that grief like this doesn't arrive once and then disappear. Kurt has talked about how it keeps catching him off guard. An old photograph, a race broadcast, watching Brexton climb into a race car the way Kyle once did as a kid in Las Vegas. That ongoing, visible grief is a big part of why Kurt's public comments have resonated so widely, both inside the racing world and beyond it, because they capture something honest about loss that an official press release never could. The timing of it all adds one more layer that Kurt has had to sit with. Just months before Kyle's death, the two brothers shared one of the happiest nights of their professional lives together on that Hall of Fame stage, with Kurt receiving his ring directly from the sibling he had once battled bumper to bumper for 2 decades. That same red carpet photo from January circulated widely again in May, for an entirely different reason, once news of Kyle's death broke. A joyous induction followed only months later by a sudden funeral. That contrast is part of what has made this entire year so difficult for the extended Busch family to process. And it's a big reason Kurt has continued to choose his public words so carefully every time he steps in front of a camera or a microphone. Kyle Busch's story didn't end the way anyone in NASCAR expected. In the months since, Kurt Busch has made sure the world understands who his brother actually was, both on the track and away from it, rather than letting the shock of those final 11 days be the thing that defines how he's remembered.